Good morning, church. And good morning to our guests. We're glad you're here. Does anybody need a family report? You want to raise your hand and one of the guys? No? No. Okay, that doesn't really work this time, does it? This is unusual, isn't it, y'all? Yeah. Um, I've definitely never talked to a congregation on a Sunday through this medium before. Never really expected that I would, but here we go. I hope that wherever you're worshiping today and wherever you are, that you're, I don't know, enjoying the time that you get to spend in praise to God and in worship to Him, and I hope that in its own strange way that today proves to be a really enjoyable experience of worship for you. Um, what I'm going to do here is just sort of an abbreviated version of what I would have preached today if we were together at the building. And I hope that it will prove to be an encouraging message and a helpful one. Um, if you have a Bible, it will be worth grabbing it because I want to talk about a passage that's probably not very familiar to us. It's from Ezekiel 47, and I know as soon as I say Ezekiel, that lets us know, some of us at least, that I'm not familiar with that, and that's fine. But I want to focus on the first 12 verses and a bit of what's happening in those verses. I'll admit that at first this is going to seem like a weird passage to talk about. It's going to seem like one of those things that is so completely unconnected to what's happening in our lives right now. But if you hang with me for a little bit, I think you'll hear a positive reminder that can help all of us to have our hearts set on our hope in God today. And I think it'll be a really beautiful and healthy and helpful thing. So, before I even read it, let me talk you through a bit of what's happening in this passage. So if you have a Bible, you want to be looking, like I said, Ezekiel 47. You want to look at those first 12 verses. But let me talk through what's going on there even before we read the text, before I read it to you, because it's just one of those things. The story doesn't immediately come across in translation at first. So here's what it is, okay? Ezekiel is having a vision that God is giving him in these verses. And so what's happening is in verses 1 and 2, there's water flowing out from under the steps of the temple. So it's coming out of the doors of the temple and it's coming out from under the steps, which means that water is coming from the presence of God. Now in the verses right there in the beginning of this little section, he talks about where the water's going and all of that. And the locations don't necessarily sound immediately familiar to us, but here's what's happening. The water is flowing out from the temple, and it's flowing down to the Dead Sea. Now the temple's in Jerusalem, and everything between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea is desert. So when he says that the water's flowing out through that area, they immediately, the Jews that are hearing this at first, they immediately know that to be a desert area. And so the remarkable thing about that, the rest of the vision then, is what happens is the water as it goes becomes this transforming thing as it goes through the desert to the Dead Sea. So when it first starts, and this is like kind of that middle section of the text that you see as you scan through it, when it first starts, the water is just trickling. It's just the tiniest little stream flowing out from underneath the steps of the temple. And then a little further out, it's about ankle deep. And then as Ezekiel measures a little further out and he's led down to the stream even further, it's about waist deep or knee deep or whichever it is. It just gets deeper as it goes until eventually it's deep enough in rushing water that he can't even cross it. So number one, the stream itself is transforming, it's growing, there's more life in that as it goes. But then number two, the other thing that's happening in this vision is that stream as it flows through that deserted desert area, is life is growing around this stream. And so there's a forest springing up where this water is bringing new life to the desert. And not only that, but I love the verse in the text where look at verse 8 in this whole thing as Ezekiel's having this vision. Look at verse 8. He said to me, "This is the water that flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea." That's the Dead Sea. Remember, it's all salty and nothing, there's no fish in it and all this stuff. This is what it says, though. When the water flows into the Dead Sea, the water will become fresh. So the water comes out of the temple, flows through the desert and turns it into an abundant forest. And then it flows into the Dead Sea and brings life to the Dead Sea, so much so that there are tons of people going down and fishing in the Dead Sea, which can't happen now. Nothing lives there. There's no fish to be caught. And so that's the vision then. That's what's really happening. So can we take the time? Can I just read it? Because the way that it's written is great. And I like the language here. It's a passage that I think we should be more familiar with. So let's read it. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around to the outside, to the outer gate that faces toward the east, and behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits, and then he led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again he measured 1,000, and he led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again he measured 1,000, and he led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen this?" Then he led me back to the bank of the river. As I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on the one side and on the other. And he said to me, "This water flows toward the eastern region and goes into the Arabah and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the Dead Sea may become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, from En-gedi to Eneglaim." I probably didn't say that right, whatever. "It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. And on the banks, and on both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing." Okay. There is a ton of Bible stuff happening in these verses. If you get a chance to stop and ponder it, you ought to go read the end of Revelation and look at the tree of life and how the tree of life sits on both sides of the river, how it bears fruit 12 kinds of fruit, which kind of fits with every month from Ezekiel right here. You ought to look at how, what was the other connection I thought about with that? And the leaves that were for healing, that's the same in Revelation 21 as well. You ought to just go read the tree of life and look at the trees in this vision as well, and the river in Revelation compared to the river in Ezekiel. All that's for another time. We can go deep on that another time. Here's what I want to show you. The really fascinating thing about that to me is the recurring motif of, and like the recurring idea that this water that comes from the temple is giving life. So it's giving life to the desert, it's giving life to the Dead Sea, it's giving life to people who are now able to fish and pick the fruit and to be healed from the leaves of these trees. So over and over again, there's multiple layers where what comes out of the presence of God, this water from the temple, gives life. And it gives abundant life at that. And so when you think about that, what do you think would be, in the Bible, what do you think would be the ultimate fulfillment of life coming forth from the presence of God? Well, anytime you ask a question about what's going to be the ultimate fulfillment of some biblical concept, it almost always points us to Jesus, and that definitely happens here. So there's two ways where this happens, and I'll give them to you quick just to think about here. Number one, when Jesus comes into the world, he tells the people that are listening to him over and over again that he is the temple. And so he says, destroy this temple and I'll build it up in 3 days. And so he's telling them, and he's talking about the temple that is his body. And so what he's telling them is that my presence is the presence of God come to be close to you. And John will talk about that in the opening to his gospel, that God came and dwelt. He tabernacled among us. That's a temple, God's presence being with his people. So that's number one. Jesus is connected to the temple in Ezekiel's vision, from whence all this life flows. But the second thing is, Jesus also at one point when he's having the conversation with the woman at the well, he says that I will give you living water so that you will never thirst again. So you take two elements from Ezekiel's vision where here's the temple, the presence of God, and life comes out of that temple. And Jesus says, I am both. That I am the presence of God come to be with you on earth. And I am the water that gives life, that flows from the presence of God. And so what's the ultimate fulfillment of what Ezekiel's vision is about? It's Jesus. And in both ways that God would give life, he gives that life through Jesus. So that kind of leads us to think about, okay, then what do we do with that? What does that mean for us? And I would just put it to you in these two very simple statements, that as life flowed from the temple to the desert in Ezekiel's vision, the Word of God ought to flow from us, God's people as his temple. It ought to flow from the church to the world, because that Word is the gift of life that God has given, and it will bring life to the world. And then the second statement is, just as God was pouring life into the Dead Sea in Ezekiel's vision, through Jesus, he's pouring life into our hearts, and into our hearts that would otherwise be dead because of sin. And so the vision is connected to so many things through the entire scheme of the Bible, and because of that, it does basically what the whole Bible does, and it points us to Jesus and to the life that we have in him. So now I told you I knew that probably seems like Bible nerd stuff, and Dan, what connection does that possibly have to what's going on with us today, and especially like we're all at home, none of us are at church, there's something major going on in the world. What connection does any of this have to any of that? Well, it's that gift of our salvation in Jesus, the living water that he is springing up in our hearts, the well of living water that springs up within us because of his gift of life, and the fact that he came and was the temple that dwelt among us, that he was God's presence close to us. It's that gift and the gifts of salvation that come with that give us eternal hope way beyond whatever life throws at us. And so when, I know I've said this before, but Christians, God gives us the ability to take a long view of reality. And so even in the times when we live in the valleys of the Dead Sea for a long time, or even if we live there for a whole lifetime, in the end, at the end of all things, God makes all things work together for good for those who love him. And it's that long view of reality that helps us to see that. So, one of the points that I think we can take away from this marvelous little vision, which I hope that you're intrigued by, and I hope that you'll keep reading it through the rest of the day, but one of the things that I think we can take away from this marvelous little vision and all of its connections throughout the Bible is that God cares about his people, and that he will give us life through himself, in himself. And it really does take a long view of reality for us to value that as much as we should, but it's such a powerful truth when we do value it as we should. So, with all that's happening this week, with all this craziness, with pandemic scare and that everything that's going on with that, what I want to encourage you to do is to keep your mind firmly set on the fact that the God who gives abundant life is still on his throne giving abundant life. for most of us, self included here, for most of us, this whole experience with quarantine rules and emergency preparations being made en masse, this whole thing, it's brand new. Under a certain age, all of us have lived in an America where we just haven't done this sort of thing in our lifetimes. Some of you, some of you remember the Cold War, and some of you remember some things like this from the end of World War II and that sort of stuff. But this is brand new for most of us, for a lot of us anyway. But in spite of all the new experiences, and in spite of the fear and the uncertainty that some of this stuff can bring, we still serve the God who gives life and restoration, and we look forward to living with Him eternally, safe from all of the difficult, scary, very humbling experiences that life can throw at us. And so I hope that is a hope that you can hold on to throughout this week, no matter how bad the situation gets and no matter how good the situation stays, whichever may be the case. The reality is that God is still on His throne and He's still good to us, and we can be grateful for that from now into eternity. There's a couple other things that I wanted you to think about, a couple of things I just wanted to remind you of. Number one, there's another video posted here on the YouTube channel where Corey Bird talked through the thoughts that he had prepared for communion this morning, if we were going to be together for that. And so if you, it's there for whoever might find it helpful in taking communion at home or wherever you're worshiping today. You might find that other video helpful. The link is in the email that I sent you a little while ago, or you can just go down into the description below this video and it will be there as well. And then the other thing I just wanted to remind you of is let's just pray for each other. Just make sure that you do that. Pray especially, I think, for our older members and for those, like everybody keeps saying in the media and from government communications and all that. Pray for those with compromised immune systems in whatever different forms that may take. But let's be praying for each other and for our brothers and sisters. And let's stay connected this week, even though we're not together in person. Let's make sure that we're connected and that we're living out that connection that we know in our hearts is real because of Jesus in us. So that's it. I hope you have a great day today. I miss being there with you, but I hope that it is a blessed day for you and that you're in living for God and in worshiping Him today, that you're blessed in doing that. So I'll talk to you later.